Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful that you have decided to spend some time with me as I talk about the Fantasy Reader book tag. Now, I have self-tagged once again. I saw this one floating around and I thought, this one looks right up my alley. But if you are a booktuber who hasn't done this tag yet and you want to do it, consider yourself tagged, especially if you're a fantasy reader, obviously. But without any further preamble, let's just dive right into this. Question 1 says, what is your fantasy origin story? How you came to read your first fantasy novel? So I grew up with books right from the very beginning. My parents read to me when I was a little kid, and I've been reading for as long as I physically could read. So some of the earlier books that my parents read to me were the Chronicles of Narnia series. That was probably my initial introduction to the whole fantasy genre outside of kids' books. And then after that, they also read to me and my siblings The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So these, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, are really what kind of sunk their hooks into me. They became the standards that I sort of looked for in future reading within this genre. And I'll be honest, I've struggled with the fantasy genre in general. As much as I love it, as much as I crave that escapism into a fantasy world to take me away from real life, I'm sort of caught in this limbo between the old and the new. I really want a fantasy world that is kind of light and whimsical, something along the lines of Rivendell or the Shire in Lord of the Rings, and not something that's grimdark or really just kind of overall dreary and depressing like the Mistborn world of the Falling Ash. So in that sense, I really like kind of some of the older classic settings better than the modern kind of darker, grittier stuff. I also like the old school creatures and races, the dwarves and elves and goblins and all that stuff. It really fills me with a lot more nostalgia than some of the more made-up races you'll see in modern fantasy. More made-up races, as if goblins and elves aren't made up too. You know what I mean in terms of the modern stuff that tries to step away from that classic tropes and races, I suppose. And then there are the plots. I love a good old-fashioned quest or a journey or adventure. I'm not so much into what I probably incorrectly view as the more modern approach with political machinations and wars and stuff happening on more of a nation level. I would rather deal with kind of a small group of characters who are on some kind of adventure as opposed to nations warring with each other. So I want this old school setting with the old school characters, but with modern writing. What I don't want from that old fantasy writing is, first of all, the sometimes lower quality of the writing, and then also too, about in terms of how women are treated in those old fantasy books, if they're even present in general, other than being a love interest for the men. I want the modern writing with the great prose, the LGBTQ plus romances, the strong, powerful women, and I want all this good writing in the kind of classic setting. So that's where I really struggle. There have been so many fantasy series where I've just read book 1 of the series and then DNF'd the rest of it. And I could probably make a video at some point, I probably will, about the series that I've just read book 1 in and then abandon the rest of the series, because I just keep searching for this formula that doesn't seem to exist in modern fantasy. But we'll get more into that as I get through the list. I've really sidetracked myself on question 1, so let's carry on. Question 2 is, if you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy novel, who would be the author, and what's one trope you'd insist be in the story? Now, the author I would insist upon writing me into their story is Guy Gavriel Kay. You're going to see his name come up quite a bit in my fantasy reader tag here, and that's fine. I want you to read more Guy Kay novels. He's written some of my favorite books of all time, and again, we'll talk more about that as the list goes on here. But in terms of the trope that I would insist be in it, I really want found family to be present. And this is because of my kind of sad real life situation where I did have a small group of friends who I considered to be my chosen family. But then when my wife left me, they too took themselves out of my life. And so that found family I had, I no longer have. So if Guy K could write me a wonderful found family to give to me in my book, that would be amazing. Question 3 is, what is a fantasy you've read this year that you want more people to read? Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit on this in terms of the this year restriction. I think the only fantasy I've read so far this year is the Lacanius trilogy. I'm more than 3/4 of the way through that rather huge trilogy, and I'm going to do a whole big video about it when I finally complete it, but it's one that I have, again, some mixed feelings about, and so it wouldn't be an automatic recommendation. Similarly with fantasy I've read earlier in this year, it wouldn't necessarily be automatic recommendations. I did read Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay, which was a very good book, but again, only for a certain group of people who are into that kind of high fantasy / historical fantasy setting. But the trilogy I do want everybody to read is the Fionnevar Tapestry, which is also by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is my favorite high fantasy series of all time. It eclipses even The Lord of the Rings for me, which is high praise given the place that Lord of the Rings has had in my life over the years. It's a very approachable book because it opens up in modern day Toronto, Canada, and the characters are then sucked from the modern timeline into this whole medieval world, sort of Narnia style, going back to Narnia. So it starts in that modern setting that makes it really easy to dive into. It's a wonderful big story, but it's not one of these fantasy novels that's just chock full of dozens and dozens of characters and places and intertwining events to try to keep track of. It's just a wonderful, beautiful, straightforward fantasy trilogy that I want you to read as soon as possible. And then I want you to get back to me and tell me how much you loved it. So, the Fionnevar Tapestry, the first book of which is The Summer Tree. Definitely look that up if you're into fantasy at all. Question 4 is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre? What subgenre have you not read much from? So, I think my favorite fantasy subgenre, I guess, would be just your standard high fantasy. Like I said, it's these magical worlds that really draw me in for that beautiful escapism that I crave. Series like the Fionnevar Tapestry and Lord of the Rings are really what makes my heart sing. So as basic an answer as it is, that's probably the case. As far as one that I've not read much from, but I would love to find more good books in, we have steampunk. And I did read The Aeronaut's Windlass by Jim Butcher either earlier this year or late last year. I think it was earlier this year. But it was one example of a steampunk novel that was good, that was not particularly amazing, but it was just kind of a fun read. There was one other steampunk trilogy, I think, that I read not long after my second Crohn's surgery that, if I can remember it, I'll put the name of it here for you to see. But again, that was merely good and fun, but not super amazing. I would love to find a steampunk book that knocked my socks off. There's just something about that whimsical setting, the fun gears and gadgets and all the interesting things that could be done with it. It's just one that I would love to see more of if possible. Before we get into the next question here, I want to let you know that this video is brought to you by my Patreon supporters. In particular, I want to send out a thank you to my higher Patreon tier supporters, Joanna, Paul, and Mojo. Your support just means the world to me. If you have just a couple bucks a month that you can contribute to my channel and the work that I do here, look me up on Patreon. I would love to have you along. It just encourages me so much to keep putting in the hours of editing that I do to keep this channel going. So even if you can't support financially, just the fact that you're here watching, that you might take a second to give a thumb up and subscribe to my stuff, just really means the world. So thank you, and let's get back to this. Question 5. Who is one of your auto-buy fantasy authors? Can you guess? Yep, it is Guy Gavriel Kay, who actually, I think he lives in Toronto, so he's quite local to me. I'm not far outside of Toronto myself. But besides the Fionnevar Tapestry, which is my favorite high fantasy series, he wrote a duology, the two-part Sarantine Mosaic, that is more kind of like historical fantasy fiction, and it is just, it's in my top 10 favorite books of all time, regardless of genre. Just some of my favorite fiction ever. So he's definitely been my favorite author. Now, I can't necessarily say he's an auto-buy because he has had some misses for me too. Certainly if you've watched my videos over the past couple of years, you've seen in recent years that I have tried a couple of his books that just didn't hit home for me. But for the most part, I really love what he does. Question 6 is, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? Goodreads, YouTube, podcasts, Instagram, etc. So for me, it comes occasionally through friend recommendations, also through BookTube. If you watched my recent book haul, you'll see that I am quite influenced at times by what booktubers are talking about, if I feel it's something that would really hit with me. I've spent time simply Googling best fantasy series and bringing up whatever forums that brings up. And then I spend a lot of time researching in Goodreads. Once I hear from booktubers or friends or wherever else about these fantasy books and series, then I'll dive into Goodreads and I'll look them up and read good comments and bad comments and the in-between comments. I really find 3-star ratings to be quite helpful because they tend to present the most balanced approach. But I do spend a lot of time on Goodreads to finalize sort of the order that my TBR is going to happen in, and that's kind of how I prioritize my reading is based on both the ratings and the comments I see in Goodreads. Speaking of which, number 7 is, what is an upcoming fantasy release you're excited for? And I have 3 series I want to mention here. These are all series that have at least one book out, and they have more to come. Now, I refuse to start a series until the series is complete. After being burned by Patrick Rothfuss with The Name of the Wind, I just outright refuse to start anything that isn't completed already. And so no, I have not read anything from A Song of Ice and Fire. If I'm going to commit that time, that emotional energy into diving into a world, I want to know that there's going to be an ending there. So these ones are ones that are in the works that have not been completed yet, and so they are on my radar, and all 3 of these look just amazing. They would be at the top of my TBR priority list. I would be reading them right now if they were available. So the first of these 3 is the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne, the first book of which is called The Shadow of the Gods. Now, I haven't actually read John Gwynne's previous series, which is The Faithful and the Fallen. There are 4 books in that series that I haven't gotten to yet, but I assume that over the next year or 2, I'll have time to read through The Faithful and the Fallen before the Bloodsworn Saga is complete, so that I can have that as a background. And again, my enjoyment of that series will probably determine whether or not I continue with the Bloodsworn Saga, but by all accounts, it looks like a series that would really interest me. The second one is called the Darkwater Legacy series by Chris Wooding, and it starts off with the Ember Blade. This one appeals to me because it does look like that happy medium that I'm looking for between kind of old school fantasy setting and modern writing, and maybe it can blend those things to make the perfect fantasy series for me. I don't know much about it other than it's another one that just looks fantastic. And then the third one is the God King Chronicles series by Mike Brooks that starts with The Black Coast. This one looks really interesting in that we have 2 kind of major nations or cultures who are coming into conflict, but instead of pursuing war, they are trying to pursue peace. So from what I understand, it's a series about peacemaking rather than war making, which would be such a wonderful change of pace to the usual violence and war that we see in so much fantasy. Now, I understand there is plenty of fantasy and war involved with that series, don't get me wrong, but the whole idea of cultures trying to find peace with each other is something that sounds really, really interesting. And that Black Coast cover looks pretty cool too, I have to admit. With that one though, I don't know, I think there are 2 books out, and I'm not seeing anything. I need to do a bit more research because I'm not sure if that series continues past 2 books or if it's completed at 2. I'm gonna have to figure that out. Question number 8. What is one misconception about fantasy you would like to lay to rest? Well, I think one I would like to lay to rest is that fantasy covers are terrible. Okay, forget about that. Let's say that the fantasy misconception I want to lay to rest is that fantasy is for nerds. I think that anybody who has any kind of imagination whatsoever could really get into the fantasy genre with the right books. I'm not saying that I'm not a nerd. I mean, my favorite pastimes involve books and board games, so take that for what it's worth. But it's not just for us geeks. It's for really anybody who can get lost in a wonderful imaginary world. And then the final question, number 9. If someone had never read a fantasy before and asked you to recommend the first 3 books that come to mind as places to start, what would those recommendations be? So first off, the easiest thing to dive into that I would recommend would be the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. It is written for a child audience, so it's definitely geared towards a young crowd, and that makes it very easy to get into. I'm not exactly sure what I would think about that series now as a middle-aged guy, as opposed to, I think the last time I read this series was when I was in my early 20s. And at the time, the overt Christian messaging of the series didn't bother me as much as my older atheistic self would really appreciate. But in terms of an easy, whimsical series to dive into, that could be it. If you're not so much into that kind of middle grade level of reading, you want something older, then the Fiona of our Tapestry would be a good replacement, because like I said, it has that parallel with the Narnia series where I'm back to the board games again, where characters are starting off in a modern day setting and being sucked into this fantasy world. So the Fiona of our Tapestry, if somebody wants an adult read rather than a more middle grade read, that would be the place to start. So that would be my first recommendation. Although you can see I snuck 2 into that first recommendation. My second one would be The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Even if they don't go on to read the rest of the Lord of the Rings series, The Hobbit is a great little standalone adventure book. Again, it was written towards a younger audience, so it is a story that is easy to get into, and it would give the reader a very great basic foundation of fantasy if they were not previously a fantasy reader. Why not start with Tolkien, the one who really kind of kicked off the whole genre? Now, I'm not saying he invented the genre, but really he's the one that caused it to blow up into what it's become and has influenced so much of what came after. So The Hobbit would be, I think, a great starting place. And then the third and final one, I gotta end again with my guy K, and this is The Last Light of the Sun. This is a standalone novel from Guy Gavriel Kay, and it takes place in a setting that would be kind of parallel to the history of ancient England in kind of the late 900s thereabouts, when the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and the Celts and Picts were all sort of interacting with each other. That's the setting of the story, except with fantasy sprinkled throughout it all. So if anybody is into history or historical settings that also involve fantasy elements, The Last Light of the Sun was just a really fun read. If I recall correctly, it was the very first Guy Kay book I ever read, and really hooked me into his writing. So that would be one that I would pull out for a new fantasy reader too. So you've heard me talk about what I love about fantasy and what I'm looking for. So please, for the love of the reading gods, if you could just give me some recommendations based on what I said I enjoy and don't necessarily like. I would love to hear them. If you want to answer any of these questions, please carry on the conversation in the comments below. I will definitely read what you have to say and reply. Nothing fills me with more pleasure than just being able to read your thoughts and carry on the conversation. And as always, thanks so much for stopping by today. Hey, it's Josh. You know why I'm here. Sometimes you just need that friendly reminder to give a little thumb up, to subscribe to the channel, to share the video with somebody who would enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. Hi, I'm Josh, and I'm so grateful that you have joined me. Hi, I'm Josh. 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 Question 1 says, what is your And I've run into some problems with the fantasy show. I love to see that. It really fills me with a lot more. It wouldn't necessarily be automatic go either So, oh.